The VILTRUMITE Empire has to be one of the most fascinating aspects about the Invincible universe. A race of practically immortal world conquerors whose strength is comparable to, if not greater than Superman's, the VILTRUMITES are always presented as a threat to the universal order. But that made us think about order within their own ranks. And turns out, even savage warriors have systems in place to make their killing as efficient and effective as possible. In this video, we will take a look at the structure and hierarchy of the VILTRUMITE Empire, discuss the different organizations that exist within it, and how they evolve over the course of the series. So put on your spoiler hats, because this will be one rough ride, and let's get straight to it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Our most trusted officers were each given a planet to weaken by themselves.
The first Emperor and his VILTRUMITE Council, how VILTRUMITE society was shaped. So, thousands of years ago, long before Nolan came to Earth, or grew his mustache, or was even born, society on Viltrum was quite divided. The VILTRUMITES were strong, stronger than any other species in the universe, but they weren't exactly different from any of them. The strong proved their strength by imposing it on others, and that must have been true for Viltrum as well. There is no record of civilized life on the planet until the emergence of their great first emperor. No one knows where Argal came from, or how he became emperor, considering he wasn't exactly the strongest, or at least that's what we're led to believe. But everyone agrees that Argal was followed not for his strength, but for his quote-unquote wisdom. He had a vision for his people that was so sublime that once he burst onto the political scene, he became undeniable. And through a series of fortunate events, Argal found himself in the position of emperor. Now here's the thing, we know basically three other things about him, apart from the fact that he rose to power. The first is that he ruled for about 5,000 years. The second is that he was the one who put the VILTRUMITES on the path of becoming conquerors. And the third is the fact that he was eventually assassinated by one of his own soldiers. Apart from these things, we know practically nothing about Argal's life, but we can infer what the structure of Viltrum's society must have been like based on contextual clues and what the story itself tells us. For starters, Viltrum's societal structure became an absolute monarchy under Argal, who consolidated his power with words as much as fists. We say this because the succession to his throne was based on traditional laws of primogeniture. Only his eldest male heir could ascend the throne after him, which is the very definition of a monarchy, but he didn't exactly centralize all his power. It is unclear how many organizations existed under his authority, but we at least know of one governing body that was active during Argal's age, and that was the High VILTRUMITE Council. This council was part of his decision-making process, and without their approval, Argal probably didn't even lift a finger, unless it was a matter of great importance. And he must have delegated much of the finer details of his plans for the universe to his council, because we know one thing about his reign with absolute certainty, and that is the fact that he was the one who tipped the VILTRUMITES towards their social Darwinian mindset. Otherwise, there would be no reason for Thetis to assassinate his leader, who was beloved by every other VILTRUMITE. Argal's wisdom only extended to his own people, because within the larger context of universal domination, every VILTRUMITE was important. He'd probably realized that even the weakest of his people were stronger than everyone else, so he eliminated divisions within his home planet and united them all against a common enemy, other alien races. Much of Viltrum's technological advancement would have been devised during his golden age, because that's when their culture was at its peak. Argal facilitated such scientific progress that his species found solutions to every known pathogen in the universe, and developed technology that could fix a planet's climate overnight when compared to the natural course. Yet at the same time, they conquered and enslaved other races, all for the glory of their emperor. Thetis was the first VILTRUMITE to realize that while things might be going well on Viltrum, they weren't so good elsewhere. And besides, Argal had no plans of slowing down. He'd commissioned his council to create and train the strongest possible soldier in his planet's history, and there was only one reason he'd want such a weapon: to turn it against his enemies. Argal had accumulated many enemies during his life, to the point that he'd scattered his children to the wind, with the only proof of their existence being recorded in a list he kept securely locked away. He did this so no one from outside his empire could threaten his position, but little did he know, his greatest threat had been working alongside him all this time. When Thetis finally made his move, the Viltrum Empire was thrown into complete disarray. Argal might not have completely centralized governance, but he was like a god to his people. His death disintegrated any semblance of order that he'd established during his life, as the Viltrumites reverted to their quarrelsome ways. Argal's work would have been undone in a fraction of a Viltrumite's lifespan if his intended strongest soldier hadn't also been disciplined in multiple related arts of war. But because he managed to preserve the most prominent aspects of Argal's rule, which some would even call the worst. But considering he's the man who shaped our current understanding of Viltrumite society, we cannot discount his contributions to their culture.
Some species resisted, of course, but no one could withstand us for long.
The World Conquering Committee and the Grand Regent. We're pretty sure that since Argal was basically commanding a planet-wide army, that he had all the customary military office positions under his council, like generals and captains. But the only named general we ever meet is Craig, and he is the right-hand man for Thrag, and quite possibly his only senior military officer. That's because all those other titles would have gone for a toss after Argal's death, seeing as the Viltrumites returned to their primal, chaotic roots. Their entire society shifted towards civil war, because with no one to point them in the direction of external enemies, their gaze turned inward. As Argal's subjects tore themselves apart, one man emerged from the blood and the ashes as the unquestionable, strongest member of his species, Thrag. Thrag was the man Argal had made to represent the ideal Viltrumite, and after the downfall of his liege, Thrag did what he thought was best of his people. He participated in, if not outright organized, the Great Purge, an event that saw stronger Viltrumites systematically cull weaker Viltrumites. There were several members of his species who were older than him, but Thrag's strength was unmatched. Soon enough, he had the entire planet under his thumb, and seeing his dominance during the Purge, the High Viltrumite Council decided that he was the man to lead them into their future, at least for the time being. Thrag was appointed Grand Regent of the Empire, and his goals were simple on paper, but extremely difficult to achieve in practice. Thrag was tasked with not only ensuring that Argal's legacy continued through conquests, he was also supposed to find his heirs and seat one on the throne. That latter half was supposed to be most of his duty, because the position of regent is temporary by nature. Regents are usually appointed when the ruling monarch is incapacitated or too young to make enforceable decisions. Rarely do they outstay their welcome, but Thrag did by like centuries, because he just couldn't find Argal's heirs. Initially, he dedicated significant resources to finding them, because he was determined to not dishonor his liege in any way, shape, or form. But that changed when the Scourge virus hit his people and reduced them from 5 billion Viltrumites to about 50. This was a massive blow to Thrag's plans for universal domination, because he'd set up a system for conquering planets that was lethally effective. After his appointment was confirmed, Thrag proposed the establishment of a World Conquering Committee, seeing as that was what Argal had devoted much of his life to. Argal wanted the Viltrumites to display their dominance over all others, so to make that process faster, he wanted to involve every living Viltrumite in the most productive way possible. The World Conquering Committee was going to have 3 broad divisions. The Scouting Division would search the stars for planets with signs of intelligent life and civilizational progress that was at its tipping point. The Viltrumites were smart like that, because they knew that ruling over entirely backward races had no glory, and fighting highly advanced civilizations might be fatalistic. So they chose targets that were at the precipice of ungodly progress, because then their offer would go over a lot smoother once it was made. The second division was the Outpost Division, which set up watchtowers in several star systems that the Viltrumites were earmarking for an invasion. This allowed them to not only keep a close eye on their targets, but also dissuade other interested parties and mobilize their forces a lot more efficiently. And finally, there was the Ground Division, which, depending on a planet's response to their offer, comprised of either soldiers or scientists. If a target world accepted the World Conquering Committee's offer, the scientists would go down to the surface and help advance the home civilization with Viltrumite tech in exchange for complete loyalty. If their offer was rejected, soldiers would descend upon the world and annihilate it. A test run of this new method of conquest proved to be so successful that the World Conquering Committee became the most sought-after organization in Viltrum, because every Viltrumite wanted to be a part of the action. In fact, That's how Nolan became a high-ranking member of the Empire in the first place. He enlisted with the committee in his youth because he, like most other Viltrumites from his time, had been indoctrinated with their might makes right ideology. And during his time as a member of the committee, Nolan brought hundreds of planets to heal. With time, several other committees like this one could have cropped up, leading to further demarcation of Viltrumite society, because that's usually how civilizational progress works. But the Scourge virus changed everything. It reduced the Viltrumites' ranks so much that they were forced to mobilize their satellite planets to supplement their conquests, and the World-Conquering Committee had a crisis on its hands. With only 50 Viltrumites left, how were they supposed to keep Argal's dream and their race alive? Before the virus hit them, all they had to do was send an overwhelming platoon of their people to a planet, and their victory would be all but guaranteed. But conquering galaxies with 50 good men sounds like a Bronn joke, and this isn't Season 8 of Game of Thrones. Like we mentioned earlier, Thrag's primary concern officially should have been looking for Argal's kids, but unofficially, it became ensuring the preservation of his race and his own power. Thrag stopped looking for Argal's successors after the Scourge, because he figured they'd died by then. Besides, he felt that he'd earned his command after all the great ideas he'd come up with, so Thrag decided to solve his population problem with another great idea. He told all his soldiers to simply lie about their true state, and it worked for centuries. The Viltrumites let it slip that they'd conquered so many planets that their ranks were stretched out too thinly. But they held fast to the idea that that didn't matter, because they were omnipresent regardless, and for the longest time, just the threat of their appearance sold this lie. While this lie was taking root across the universe, they also decided to alter their conquering strategy. Instead of sending in massive forces like they used to, they would send in small excursion teams to intimidate planets into submission, and show up in strength when one didn't. They also came up with a sleeper agent program, whereby they'd send one of their high-ranking soldiers to a target world and give them 500 years to bring it under Viltrumite control. These soldiers would have full control over how they chose to execute their mission, as long as they made progress. And Nolan was sent to Earth as part of this program. Since he was the first one to be sent on such a mission, we have no idea if the strategy was effective elsewhere, but on Earth, it was a disaster. That's because Nolan's time on Earth did the unthinkable to himself. He betrayed his people. He came to realize that he truly loved his wife and son from Earth, and that because of them, he couldn't hurt Earthlings either. When Nolan turned his back on Viltrum, he turned it all the way, and that culminated in him assisting the coalition of planets attack his homeworld. Once he did that, it became clear that the old Viltrum Empire structure would no longer be viable. Nolan was living proof that Viltrumites can change and become more compassionate, more caring about people that weren't even their own. Thrag had created the perfect killing recipe, but Nolan represented redemption for the Viltrumites. This is why, when the truth about his heritage came out, it became a symbol of a new dawn for the Viltrum Empire. The transitional phase between Thrag and Mark. Thrag observed a strict hierarchy of reporting where he was at the top of the list. Craig was his second, Anissa was his third, and we guess you can say Conquest was his fourth. But he ran a regime of tough enforcement, because he didn't tolerate mistakes, and he impressed his authority over his subordinates all the time. When the Coalition blew up Viltrum, Thrag was furious. He killed Thetis and quote-unquote avenged Argal. He broke Oliver's face and arm, and would have killed both Mark and Nolan had he not realized a better path to revenge. Thrag decided to relocate the remaining Viltrumites to Earth, seeing Mark as a sign that the Empire could truly be revived through Earthlings. But once he gets there, his people start changing. His general falls in love with and has children with 12 human women, and Thrag also discovers that 2 of the 3 great traitors of his race were actually related to his liege. When Mark is put in a situation that only Thrag can get him out of, the Grand Regent is informed that his blood is a match for Argal's, which sends Thrag over the top. He tries to kill Mark and Nolan to retain control over the Viltrumites, but he ends up getting exposed and stopped in his tracks. Thrag's imprisonment is where the Viltrumite revolution begins, because instead of condemning him to death, as would have been his right, Nolan sentences him to permanent exile. Before, if a Viltrumite had done what Thrag did, they'd have gotten the treatment that Nolan was nearly given in that prison ship, because that's how Thrag had structured his empire's social customs. His entire reign as regent focused on the glory of the past, and under him, a Viltrumite execution ensured that the sentenced got the appropriate treatment to get them to full strength on the day they meet their fate. Nolan was supposed to be executed by two men who looked up to him, but he wouldn't put any of his subjects through that decision if he could help it. Nolan's decision to exile Thrag was the first time a Viltrumite was spared, despite committing treason, and that's just the first step. He dismantled the World Conquering Committee and shifted his people's focus to repopulating alone. He worked with Robot to safeguard his people from Robot's takeover of Earth, and prioritized Viltrumite repopulation over petty squabbles who deserves to rule the planet. Nolan even turned them into a force for good, because his associations with Cecil and Alan meant that his people were practically on call for heroism. By the time Nolan died, the Viltrumites had become galvanized behind their second emperor and abandoned their days of causing wanton destruction. They became his personal army in all but name, and he preserved Thrag's chain of command to an extent to show them his reconciliatory spirit. By the time Nolan bowed out of the story, every single Viltrumite had changed for the better, and no one embodied that better than Anissa. At the beginning of his reign, she assaulted his son because she was still an old-school Viltrumite, but when she finally fell for a human, she truly understood the inhumanity of what she'd done to Mark, and in her final moments, she redeemed herself by keeping Eve alive. This would have been unimaginable for the Anissa we met initially in the series, because she was dedicated to nothing more than the growth of the Empire. Sure, she might still carry that goal in her heart, but it isn't expressed through violence. It's expressed through the love she has for her children. Nolan breaks down most traditions and social stigmas that his people have carried for thousands of years and turns them into a blank canvas of goodness. This canvas is what his son inherits, and when Mark becomes the man in charge, he accomplishes something that was a lie the first time it was said in the series. When Nolan told Mark about Viltrum at age 7, he heavily sugarcoated the truth because he had no idea if his son could handle it unvarnished. But once Mark became an adult, he made sure that his father's words came true. World Betterment Committee, Conservation Committees, and more. Structure of future Viltrum Empire. Upon Mark Grayson's ascension to the throne, he was in a unique position where he had his father's ideals, but his grandfather's resources. Nolan might have reigned as king for half a decade, but he had less than 50 Viltrumites under his command. Sure, many of them had children, but it would take time for them to manifest their powers, and besides, they were under Robot's custody for a very long time. Mark inherited all those Earth-born Viltrumites, plus all of Thrag's children, who surrendered to him during his final battle with the Mad Lad, so he had a proper army at his disposal. Thrag didn't just have a baby or two, he fathered as many children as he possibly could, to give himself an edge in the final battle with Nolan and Mark that he knew was coming. The result was that he sired thousands of children, and Mark inherited a full army from his predecessors. Instead of lingering at Earth, where he'd only invite trouble, he took his people to the stars and got to work on fulfilling his dad's final wish. At the beginning of Invincible, Nolan told Mark a false version of Viltrum's history. He claimed that their home was a blue paradise filled with super-powered yet super peaceful people who always got along. Because of their benevolent nature, they created a high council to oversee rapid technological advancements, and once they reached breakthroughs they could replicate on other planets, they decided to take to the stars. The council unanimously agreed to establish the World Betterment Committee, whose sole job was to identify planets that needed their help. Nolan said that he came to Earth because he recognized its potential, but was denied permission to formally scout it because the higher-ups didn't see what he saw. He vowed to become Earth's defender against all kinds of danger, internal and external, because he'd been moved by its people. At the time he said it, Nolan was lying out of his butt because he was still loyal to the old ways of Viltrum. But somewhere along the line, he realized that he wasn't completely wrong, because he did like being Earth's hero. He promised to make the Viltrumites a better species to atone for their countless sins, and his son fulfilled that promise. Mark didn't exactly call his organization the World Better Committee, but it essentially had the same function. During his time as emperor, he had two broad focuses: liberation and conservation. The former was dedicated to planets still under the yoke of subjugation, even if it wasn't at the hands of his people. Mark made it a point to seek out planets with unnecessarily oppressive conditions, and used his daughter Terra as his champion and invincible off-Earth. His son Marky filled in for him as invincible on Earth, and though they drifted apart for a while, Mark managed to win him over in the end, just like he wins over every person he meets in the universe. friend or foe. While the liberation team's focus was on liberating planets, the conservation team's focus was on conserving alien biology of all kinds on all sorts of remote planets. Tara becomes Mark's champion much later in life. Her first ambition was to become an intergalactic conservationist, so she joins her dad's conservationists to preserve life of every kind. We see her visiting exotic alien environments and saving all kinds of flora, fauna, and potential John and Jane Does from going extinct. It's only after her dad goes to war with the coalition of planets that she changes her stance on hating her empire's past. You didn't hear us wrong there, folks. Mark Grayson goes to war with his friend Alan the Alien just to stand on business. After Thrag's death, the coalition serves no purpose beyond bureaucracy and becomes a corrupt organization. They're threatened by Mark's Viltrumites because between their liberation and conservation wings, as well as their interstellar Red Cross efforts, which saw them rescuing refugees and providing medical assistance to all kinds of worlds, they were being made to look like a joke. Alan warred with Mark because of duty, and also because he felt guilty about forcing Oliver to be his double agent, which got him killed. But once the dust settled, Mark told his friend to watch him change the universe for the better by himself, and in the final page of the comics, he does just that. Mark has reformed his species on a molecular level, to the point that universes look at Viltrumites as a force of good rather than evil space conquerors. He established protocols and institutions to ensure they never slip back into barbarity, like removing the tradition of sporting 80s blue film mustaches. Mark reorganized Viltrumite civilizational, and it was only possible because of his lineage. Under him, the hierarchy of his people was probably a lot more centralized, seeing as he loved being front and center for all the action. But even if he had a council, the only members we see are Tara and Ursal, who becomes Tara's best friend. Mark Grayson does the impossible, and he does it all in the time that his dad was supposed to conquer one measly planet. The Viltrumites come a long way since the beginning of Invincible, when they were nothing more than bloodthirsty conquerors, and that's growth if we've ever seen it. Marvelous verdict. Let us know what you think about this video in the comments, because that's all we've got for you guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Invincible content, and we'll see you guys in the next